Well, welcome. This is week 2 of our series of Apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith. And I am Dr. Ken Sawinski, and we're basing much of the material based on Dr. Geisler and Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. And this week, we are going to tackle truth. One of the first attacks on the Christian faith is that truth does not exist. There is no truth, or all truth is relative. And today I want to equip you with some logic and reason to be able to defend the reality and the validity of truth. So as we go through this series, we're going to be looking at, does truth exist? And then we're going to go into, does God exist? After that, we're going to look at miracles and ask the question, are miracles possible? And finally, is the New Testament truth? So let's begin. Does truth exist? Now, in the study of apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith, I want to review why it is that we're doing this. And there's really two reasons why we should give reasons for our belief. Number one is because reason demands it. And the second is because the Bible commands it. Our teachers will tell us there is no truth. There is no God. We're related to apes, and the Bible is filled with errors and myth. And by the way, who are you to judge? We need to be able to refute that. And not only that, but the Bible commands us. In 2 Corinthians chapter 10, it says this: the weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds. We demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. You see, we are commanded to demolish arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against the knowledge of God. And when we hear in our classes that truth doesn't exist, that there is no God, that we're related to apes, and that the Bible is filled with errors, these are all arguments and pretensions that set themselves up against God. Now, as we examine truth, I want to ask you, what is the greatest problem in America today? Is it ignorance or apathy? And unfortunately, the response you get often, don't know, don't care. And this is why we have to have a sharp mind and understand the logic, the thought, and the reasoning behind the arguments that go into the reality of truth and the reality of God. Now, we're going to go back to school and we're going to go to Logic 101. Logic is the science of reasoning. An argument is a collection of statements, and a conclusion is formed from a series of premises. So just as an example, premise 1 is all humans are mortal. Premise 2, Joe is a human. And the conclusion, therefore, Joe is mortal. Now, if the premises are all true, then the conclusion is valid. The conclusion follows from the premises. So let me give you another example of a logical argument. Number 1, premise: all men are insane. Number 2, Ken is a man. Therefore, Ken is insane. Well, in this logical argument, which I've heard from my wife on many occasions, the conclusion is valid, but it is arguably untrue. Because if all men are not insane, then it does not necessarily follow that I, as a man, am insane. So, what we need to understand about a valid logical argument is that if the premises are true and the conclusion is valid, then the conclusion is true. But if the premises are false and the conclusion is valid, then the conclusion is not proven logically to be true. Actually, the conclusion may be true, or it may be false, but it is not logically proven to be true. And finally, if the premises are true, but the logic is faulty, then the conclusion is not valid. So let's look at some definitions and break this down. Number one, reality. Reality is the way things are. Belief. Belief is the way things that we understand them to be. And truth is the correspondence between reality and our beliefs. In other words, truth is that correspondence between a thought that you have or a proposition and its confirmation or its correspondence with the way things really are. Let me give you an example. In the Gospel of John, in chapter 18, Jesus is talking with Pilate. And Jesus answers Pilate and says, "You say that I am a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. And with this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." You see, truth is telling it like it is. Pilate, when he asked the question, "What is truth?" he didn't wait for Jesus to respond, but instead he immediately acted as if he knew some truth. By exonerating Jesus, he was telling it like it is, because Jesus was, in fact, not guilty. Truth can be defined as that which corresponds to its object, or that which describes an actual state of affairs. Pilate's judgment was true because it matched its object. It described an accurate state of affairs because Jesus really was innocent. So we may legitimately ask the question, well, who cares about truth? But the reality is that everybody cares about truth in almost every area of their life. We care about safety when it comes to the airline industry. We would consider it appropriate to say that we are a fairly safe airline. That would not compel us to get on that plane for any airline that didn't take safety as a high priority. We expect truth in our money and finances. Nobody is going to take a dishonest financial advisor. We expect them to be truthful and honest in their dealings. We expect truth when it comes to our health. We expect our doctors to tell us what is truly going on with our medical reports so that we can make intelligent decisions about what to do. We expect truth in advertising. We expect that if somebody says a car gets 30 miles per gallon, that it in fact gets 30 miles per gallon. Nobody would buy a car or participate in an industry where they tell you that a car gets 30 miles per gallon when in fact it gets 11 miles per gallon. We expect truth. We expect truth from our spouse. Nobody wants a relatively faithful spouse. We expect truth in transportation. Can you imagine if road signs were mostly true, occasionally false? We depend on them to know where to turn left and where to turn right. We expect truth in our road signs. We expect truth in a court of law. Can you imagine a relatively truthful judge when he's meting out justice? So in most areas of our life, we expect truth. We do not expect relative truth. And some people will argue, well, that's okay for those things, but you can't expect truth when it comes to areas of morals or faith or religion, that's in a separate realm. But again, I don't think this is true. Because what are the questions of greatest consequence in our life? It's not just health and safety and finances. The greatest questions of our life are origin. Where did we come from? Identity. Who are we? Meaning. Why are we here? Morality. How should we live? And finally, destiny. Where are we going? You see, some are interested in truth when it comes to their finances and when it comes to their health, but they're not interested in truth when it comes to morality and religion. And what you'll often hear is, well, that's true for you, but not for me. And the rejection of truth is often volitional rather than intellectual. Or we might be taught, well, truth doesn't exist, or maybe truth is unknowable, or everything is relative. It's all a matter of opinion, which is another way of saying truth doesn't exist. You might hear religion is about faith, but not facts. But when we consider the most important questions of greatest consequence in our life, we consider the implication of truth to these what are called metaphysical questions. We find out that truth is actually more important, not less important, than truth in other aspects of our lives. I mean, this is common sense, because where we come from and who we are and why we're here, the truth about those things have a greater impact on our life than the road signs, or the truth in advertising that we expect, or the truth in our finances. I mean, if there is a theistic universe, if there is a God there, and that has implications about our ultimate destiny and how we live, it is more important to know about the truths of the greatest questions in life than it is about the questions of our everyday lives. Yet we say it's okay to have truth in the everyday aspect, but not the greater questions of life. That doesn't make sense. Well, today, the popular belief is in relativism. Relativism is a doctrine that knowledge, truth, and morality exists in relation to culture, society, or historical context, and are not absolute. And this is the prevailing belief in universities today. Professor Alan Bloom, in his book, The Closing of the American Mind, said, there is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes, or says he believes, that truth is relative. If this belief that truth is relative is put to the test, one can count on the student's reaction. They will be uncomprehending. That anyone should regard the proposition that truth is relative as not self-evident astonishes them, as though he were calling into question 2 + 2 = 4. The students' backgrounds are as various as America can provide. They are united only in their relativism and their allegiance to equality. Now, I'm going to assert that all truth is absolute. Something that is true for all persons, at all times, and in all places. Because truth is more than our belief. Truth is more than our subjective experience. You see, truth is true even if no one knows it. It is something outside of our minds. It is what corresponds to reality. Truth is true even if no one admits it. You can get a bunch of people together who will deny that 2 plus 2 equals 4, but that doesn't make 2 plus 2 not equal to 4. Truth is true even if no one agrees what it is. Truth is true even if no one follows it. Truth is true even if no one grasps it fully. And when you look at all of this, what we find out is that truth is something that we discover. Let me give you an example. Newton discovered the law of universal gravitation. Now, as he was discovering this law, the fact that he figured it out didn't make the laws of gravity any different the day before he figured out the gravitational laws. The truth of gravity was always there. It was just that Newton discovered what these laws that were actually in place and how they were acting. And the question is, why is this so hard? This seems like such basic common sense. Well, the answer is this: because if we believe in truth, then what's not true is false. And it feels arrogant and narrow to claim a truth. Because if Christianity and the Bible are true, then we disprove other religions as false, where they differ from the Bible. And then we are subjected to the question, which is, what makes you think you own the truth? Now, I want to talk a little bit about truth versus tolerance. Tolerance today is often viewed as an acceptance of all beliefs as equal and true. But real tolerance is actually to put up with what you believe to be false. I mean, as an illustration, if you've got somebody that is sincerely wrong, you respect the person and point out what is wrong. That is being tolerant. But to chop somebody's head off because they have a different belief from you, that is intolerant. We do not tolerate what is wrong. We tolerate people who have false beliefs. Dr. Kalenda, who is a humanist, was debating Dr. Geisler. And Dr. Kalenda, in this debate, opened by taking a copy of Dr. Geisler's book and holding it up. And he says, these Christians are very narrow-minded people. I read Dr. Geisler's book. Do you know what he believes? He believes that Christianity is true and everything opposed to it is false. These Christians are very narrow-minded people. And then, after he had his introduction, Dr. Geisler got up. And this is what he said. These humanists are very narrow-minded people. I read Dr. Kalenda's book, Religion Without God. Do you know what he believes? He believes that humanism is true and everything opposed to it is false. These humanists are very narrow-minded people. See, the point is, you may not have an agreement with a particular belief, but if you have a belief, and if you believe what you believe is true, then you are doing the same thing. Simply having a belief that is true, by definition, excludes what is false. It is not any more narrow-minded to be a Christian and believe something that is true than to be a humanist and believe that something is true, or to be Muslim and believe something is true, or to be a Hindu and believe something is true. Truth, by its very definition, excludes what is false. So, the truth about truth. Contrary beliefs are possible, but contrary truths are not possible. You can believe everything is true, but everything can't actually be true. And finally, objective truth can't be denied without being affirmed. Let me explain that a little more deeply. In logic, there is a law called the law of non-contradiction. The law of non-contradiction helps us to discover what is false. Let me show you. Opposite ideas cannot both be true at the same time and in the same sense. As an example, the earth is round or spherical, and the earth is not round, say flat. Well, they can't both be true at the same time and in the same sense. Opposite ideas cannot both be true and false at the same time. Now, the law of non-contradiction can be applied to questions about God. For example, Professor Lennox at Oxford University believes that God exists. Professor Richard Dawkins, also at Oxford University, believes that God does not exist. Well, they can't both be true. And the law of non-contradiction helps us to discern that. Now, anyone who denies the law of non-contradiction should be beaten and burned until he admits that to be beaten is not the same as to not be beaten, and to be burned is not the same as to not be burned. That is in the words of a medieval Muslim philosopher, and he's actually right in this. Because to be beaten and to be burned is not the same as to not be beaten and not be burned. And if somebody would deny that obvious basic logic, they need to be put to the test until they admit that it is not the same. So, what are some of our objections to truth? Number one, there is no truth. Number two, well, you can't know truth. Number three, all truth is relative. Number four, it's true for you, but not for me. Number five, no one has the truth. Number six, well, and by the way, you ought not to judge. So, using the law of non-contradiction is the greatest tool in discovering truth. So, the way this works is you simply take a claim and you apply the claim to itself to find out if there's a contradiction, to see if it violates the law of non-contradiction. For example, if someone were to say to you, I can't speak a word in English, what might you tell him? Didn't he just say that in English? The statement, I can't speak a word in English, violates the law of non-contradiction, because in saying it, you actually just did speak a word of English. And we call this the Roadrunner tactic. And the reason is because as Wile E. Coyote is chasing the Roadrunner, in all of the episodes, the Roadrunner finds himself going over a cliff, and he dangles for a minute as he scratches his head wondering how he got there, suspended in midair with nothing to stand on, before he crashes down to earth. When we apply the law of non-contradiction, what we find is that the person making the claim has no ground to stand on. So the Roadrunner tactic is an easy way for you to be a lie detector. So let's practice. Let's look at objection number one. There is no truth. How might we respond to that? Well, we can simply ask, is that true? Because you see, if it is true, It just violated itself in saying there is no truth. It doesn't stand. It falls apart under its own command. Let's look at objection number 2. There is no such thing as truth. Well, are you sure? Are you absolutely sure? Because if you're absolutely sure, then you've got an absolute truth. It falls apart under its own claim. Let's look at objection number 3. Well, all truth is relative. Well, is that a relative truth? And the answer is, of course, no. That's an absolute truth. Objection number 6. Well, it's true for you, but not for me. Well, is that true for everybody? How about this one? There's no truth in anything but science. That sounds like a pretty good statement, and it is one that is often made. But here's the problem. Is that a scientific statement? Because if it's not, then that falls apart too. And the answer is no, that is not a scientific statement. Well, how about this? No one has the truth. Well, if that's the case, then how do you know that that's true if no one has the truth? Each and every one of these violate the law of non-contradiction. Every one of these comments, every one of these statements falls apart when you apply the statement to itself, just like I can't speak a word in English. And by the way, let's tackle the "you ought not judge." What is the most often quoted verse in the Bible in the public sphere? The answer is Matthew 7:1. Do not judge, or you too will be judged. And so let's apply the Roadrunner technique to this question. You ought not judge. What might we say to this statement? Well, you ought not judge. Isn't that a judgment? So in judging one by saying you ought not to do this, you are in fact doing that which you say you ought not to do. Let's take a look at what Jesus said about judging. In Matthew 7:1, he says, "Judge not, or you too will be judged." However, if we carry on with this and look at the rest of the passage, he says, "For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with the measure you used, it will be measured to you." Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? How can you say to your brother, "Let me take the speck out of your eye," when all the time there's a big old plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Jesus does not teach you not to make a judgment. What Jesus teaches you is how to make a judgment. And he's teaching you that with the measure you use in judging, it will be measured to you. And also that you need to take care of your own problems in judging so that you can see clearly to make a right and correct judgment. And Jesus had more to say. In Matthew, he says this, "If your brother or sister sins, go and point out their fault. Just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you'll have won them over. But if they will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If they still refuse to listen, tell it to the church. And if they refuse to listen even to the church, treat them as you would a pagan or a tax collector." Notice here that Jesus is telling them, with brothers and sisters in the church, to go and point out their fault. He tells us how to judge. Finally, then in Titus, Paul tells us this: he must hold firmly to the trustworthy message as it has been taught, so that he can encourage others by sound doctrine and refute those who oppose it. We are to judge doctrine to see if it is sound, and we are to refute those that oppose sound doctrine. John, in his gospel, says, stop judging by mere appearances, but instead judge correctly. And he goes on in the letter of 1 John and says, dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God. Because many false prophets have gone out into the world. This is how you can recognize the Spirit of God. We are being told here to make a judgment about spirits and to test them. We are to make a judgment on them so that we can see whether they are from God or whether they are not from God. And still further on, Paul tells us in 1 Corinthians, and I won't read the whole verse to you, but he's talking about what business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. What Paul is telling us here is that we are on no grounds to judge people outside the church, but we are to judge people inside the church so that we can maintain a healthy community. And finally, James, my brothers and sisters, if one of you should wander from the truth and someone should bring that person back, remember this. Whoever turns a sinner from the error of their way will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. We are asked here that when one should wander from the truth, that a judgment is to be made, because whoever turns a sinner from the error of their ways will save them from death and cover over a multitude of sins. So the point of that aside on Jesus and judging is simply that Jesus teaches us how to judge, not from appearances, to make correct judgments, and we'll move on back to our Roadrunner tactic. So how might you respond then? You shouldn't impose your moral views on others, applying the law of non-contradiction and the Roadrunner technique to this statement. Well, is that your moral view? That you shouldn't impose your moral views on others? Is that not an imposition of their moral view being imposed on others? Or how about this one? All religious beliefs are true. How might we respond to that? Well, my religious belief is that all religious beliefs are not true. So does that make my belief true? And then how about this? You should doubt everything. My question would be, well, should I doubt that? If I'm to doubt everything? David Hume is one of the most influential philosophers in philosophy today. And David Hume was a well-known skeptic. Skepticism is a skeptical attitude. It's doubt as to the truth of something. It's a theory that certain knowledge is impossible. David Hume had an argument in regards to skepticism that has greatly influenced skepticism in the church. And this is what he taught. He had an argument that said this: all meaningful ideas are true by definition or based on sense experience. That's what empiricism is. Number 3, there are no sense experiences for concepts beyond the physical, and therefore metaphysical claims are meaningless and should not be believed. Metaphysical claims are those things that we talked about earlier. Origins, morality, destiny, purpose. And so, David Hume teaches us that meaningful propositions must either be an abstract reasoning, such as a mathematical equation or definition. For example, 2 plus 2 equals 4, or all triangles have 3 sides. These are mathematical equations or the definition of a triangle. And a meaningful proposition must be either an abstract reasoning or be verified empirically through one or more of the 5 senses. And A.J. Ayer used this argument right here in his principle of empirical verifiability. Well, that seems pretty good, but this argument can be refuted. What we do is we apply the statements to itself. And so this is how you refute Hume's skepticism. The principle of empirical verifiability states there are only 2 kinds of meaningful propositions. 1, those that are true by definition, and 2, those that are empirically verifiable. Well, the principle of empirical verifiability itself is neither true by definition or empirically verifiable. Therefore, it cannot be meaningful. We simply applied the Roadrunner tactic. We applied the law of non-contradiction to the statements itself and find that it falls apart. Well, how would we respond to somebody who says, you can't know the real world? We might ask them, well then how do you know that about the real world? Another philosopher who's had great impact on modern thought is Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant was an agnostic. In this sense, we're not talking about agnosticism towards God. We're talking about an intellectual doctrine or attitude that affirms the uncertainty of all claims to ultimate knowledge. So Immanuel Kant says, your senses and mind form all sense data. Therefore, you never know the thing in and of itself. You only know the thing to you after your mind and sense formed it. In other words, you can't know the real music stand. You can only know the music stand as it appears to you. That's because the music stand is the reflection of light on your eye. And it creates an image, and the image is formed in your mind through electrical impulses. And so what Kant is saying is you can't know the actual music stand. You can only know the music stand as the image is formed in your mind. But there's a problem with this too, and that is this. First of all, to say you can't know anything, we could rightly ask, well then how do you know that? However, he falls into something that we would call the nothing but fallacy. And let me explain that. Kant says he knows that the data that gets to his mind is nothing but phenomena. In other words, nothing but the perception in his mind. But to know this, he must have a more than knowledge. He must have a knowledge of the actual thing and the perception in his mind to know that there's a difference between them. He would have to be able to see both to be able to see the difference. Kind of like this. You can see the monkeys on the left and the original on the right. To be able to know which monkeys are the false monkeys, you have to be able to compare them to an original. And when you look at this, you can see that the monkey on the right is the equivalent to number 4, I think. Yeah, right here, eh? So, as we sit there and look and try to figure it out, we have to compare one to the other to be able to recognize the similarities and the differences. And what I'm saying is that Immanuel Kant if there's no way to distinguish between the real and perception, then you can't see the difference. And it is more reasonable to assume that they are the same, that the idea in your mind accurately reflects the thing in the real world. That is a more reasonable conclusion than to conclude that you can't know anything about the image in your mind. And so, what have we learned today? Well, number 1, that truth exists, that there is a real world that we call reality, and that truth describes what is real. That truth is telling it like it is. That it is beliefs and propositions that conform to the way things actually are. Number 2, that truth is absolute. Number 3, that truth applies to all persons in all places and in all times. That number 4, the law of non-contradiction is undeniable. That number 5, using the law of non-contradiction, we apply a statement to itself to discern false propositions. And finally, if Christianity is true, it is of infinite importance to our lives. Metaphysical questions, questions of origin, purpose, morality, and destiny are every bit as important as the things that we expect truth in the aspects of our life, such as safety. So next week, we'll go on to arguments about the existence of God, and I thank you for listening.